Okay, it's the 90s. Shit's bad in America. I mean, real bad. No, not the 1990s, the 1890s. The transition from farm to industry has the country in a deep depression. Unemployment's over 20%, and those fortunate enough to have industrial jobs are working in sweatshops and replaceable for the slightest offense. Of course, the upper class is not only thriving, they're mocking the less fortunate. So Carl Brown and Jacob Coxey are in Chicago for the World's Fair, talking about the systemic problems of the industrial economy, when Brown introduces a radical idea for the 19th century, that the government should help its citizens take care of themselves.
We don't want charity. We want jobs, and the government could provide that. We should march to Washington and convince them to hire us to fix all these shitty roads. I bet we could get hundreds, if not thousands of unemployed to march with us. It'd be a miserable trek for 2 weeks, and you'd have to pay for it.
I'm in.
So Jake and Carl start putting things together, organizing, spreading the word, making giant banners that proclaim their roles as reincarnations of Christ. Yeah, Carl's that guy in the petition, but he generally did believe in a shift in government. The Petition in Boots gains momentum quickly, and suddenly there are a few thousand unemployed people making the trek from all across the country. It's the journey of the American frontier in reverse, and the press knows just how to frame it. Many journalists travel with the petitioners, label themselves as war correspondents, and over-embellish whatever parts of the story help them sell the most copy. And this 7-week news feature has plenty of great literary potential. For example, there are great literary characters, such as a man who goes by the Great Unknown, the Veiled Lady from Chicago, the 17-year-old Goddess of Peace, Coxey's daughter, Oklahoma Sam, and undercover federal officers. The petitioners themselves are a varied group, made up of beggars, medicine men, African Americans, indigenous people, and even women. The necessity of life on the frontier means that groups are often more inclusive, but the press is more interested in the juicy stuff, like a Western group that steals 50 trains. A group stuck in Des Moines, Iowa so long they decide to build 140 boats and float downstream. A group drawn out of train cars with fire hoses and left to die in the Texas desert. Eventually they are rescued, but after 5 days in the sun, few will march on. Coxey's group is labeled his army, and this really freaks people out.
An angry army is making its way across the country. Oh shit!
The fact that they are unarmed is a nuance most people will ignore. All this means that petitioners never know what the response will be like when they arrive in town. Some towns let out school so children can see the parade-like procession. Others raise money to help them on their way and even strike up impromptu baseball games. In other towns, citizens load their shotguns with bear shot, and police usher petitioners around like cattle, placing them in virtual arrest in train cars, railroad yards, and even, baseball stadiums. No matter how different the groups are, it's easy for them to be presented as dangerous radicals, and the press nearly always sides with the police, justifying the treatment of the petitioners as protection of the upper middle class, or law-abiding citizens. You see, we believe poverty stems from moral inadequacy, not larger systemic issues. The contradiction is this: the petitioners need the press to spread their word, and the press needs the petitioners because they need something to write about. But we don't have to pay any attention to the petitioners' actual wants.
And they won't.
There's no two ways about it. It's a tough road. Tough enough physically that Jack London, a man who would spend his entire life writing about the extents of the human body, quits. I'd rather stay in jail than march anymore. And it's tough mentally, too. American workers, it turns out, are discovering the frontier doesn't provide everything. And truthfully, being unemployed is humiliating. Especially when you can't provide for your family, and your construction of the world is one where that defines you as a man. Does a man leave his family to look for work? Does a man wonder if his wife's sewing skills might provide income? Are you even a man if you have to ask for help? So between the terrain, the weather, the cops, and the shitty roads, most don't make it to Washington. Jake Coxey's group does, though his peaceful army of 500 to 600 petitioners is no match for the 1,500 cops and soldiers they find themselves up against. The arduous march across the country ends in less than 15 minutes, and Jake and Carl are thrown in jail for 20 days, found guilty of trampling the Capitol lawn. 35 years later, FDR signs the New Deal to fix those shitty roads. 50 years later, to the day, Coxey finally gives his speech on the steps of the Capitol.
We are now under the shadow of the capital of this great nation.
And however many years since the original march, we're still fighting the growing rift between the rich and poor. Journalists are still sensationalizing stories to sell copy, and police are still beating up people who are asking for equality and exercising their First Amendment rights. Maybe you've been sitting around with your friends saying, "It sucks I'm not paid as much to do the same job," or "I'm tired of racial profiling and discrimination," or "I'm tired of corporations having more rights than I do," or whatever else. And maybe you've been like me. You've succumbed to cynicism, and you poured yourself another drink saying something along the lines of, "Our government can do something, but they won't. Protests and petitions don't work." Sure, they're not instant change, and they work in ways that can sometimes be amorphous, but they do get people more politically active as a whole, and that has lasting effects. So maybe, when shit gets bad, instead of thinking we can't do anything, we can muster up even some of the idealism that drove Jake and Carl and thousands of others across the country to ask the government to do something. And maybe we can organize and spread the word and strap on some boots and step on some lawns.